Mike, my end, fine.
Yeah, we're live now. Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Equity Festival. My name is Ray Douglas, and today we welcome Dr. Brendan King. Dr. Brendan King is the author of a book. I'll get him to introduce his book, which centers around young people, masculinity, and the estates, really. Welcome. I don't know if you like to be called Dr. Brendan. I know a lot of my friends who became doctors nearly went crazy getting it. So, I'm happy to call you that because I know a lot of hard work went into it.
Thank you so much, Ray. Let's go with Brendan for the time being. I'm proud of the doctorate, but even my mum has said
Okay. So
you're
the
not a
mic.
proper doctor.
Okay, we're getting a little bit of feedback on your end, but not to worry. We'll continue. Whilst we go live, I want to give you a bit of background around Brendan. So Dr. Brendan earned his University College London, UK. He's held multiple positions working with vulnerable and at-risk youth. He's and masculinity, particularly among inner city communities. His new book, Young Black Street Masculinities, which describes how young black men on a disadvantaged housing estate in London navigate the estate's expectations of their behavior as they operate within a street code that endorses violence, knife carrying, and challenging masculinity. I'm going to extend that as well because the street code informs the men's masculine identities by promoting values of misogyny, violence, and the possession of expensive material objects while subduing any performance or features deemed as weak or feminine. Um, I'll let you elaborate on that. So tell us who Brendan King is.
So I guess let me start at the beginning, right? So I grew up in Southeast London. I won't say specifically where because it's actually where the book itself is set. But it's a corner of Southeast London which is known quite well for its proximity to violent events of the past. So not too long before I was born, we had after I was born, we had the issues with Stephen Lawrence, the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence. Not too far from where I grew up, we had the murder of Damilola Taylor as well. So prominent members of the community, be they young or slightly older, and their violence and their violent demise were in close proximity to me growing up in Southeast London. I lost a friend as well when I was just turned 14 to a murder outside of the school gates. So he was about 15 himself, murdered by a fellow teenager. And it really hit me hard. It made me deeply upset, deeply scared as well, if I'm honest. And it made me think why I was the way I was, and all of the pressures and the worries and the stresses and the strains of growing up in a inner city urban area just all came and sort of washed over me and was quite overwhelming. So I took myself off. I lived in the US for a short while to kind of escape things and came back with a different perspective a little while later. And I've spent, as you mentioned, significant amount of time working with youth organizations, working in communities where I felt there was a little bit of me in there as well growing up. So inner city youth, inner city young men, and because of again where I grew up and the family and the friends that supported me and loved me, I was exposed from quite an early age to Black culture, from West African food to hip hop and everything else in between. So I felt that the book was an opportunity to show a little bit of myself, but also to discuss some of the young men who grew up in spaces that I grew up in, and to give a little bit of insight, albeit through my perspective and my lens of what young black men are facing on a day-to-day basis. And some of the pressures that you mentioned there around pressures to perform a certain type of masculine identity, pressures to be a certain type of man as well, pressures to act or behave or adorn oneself in a certain way. And all of these things, to my knowledge, haven't yet been discussed at an academic level, maybe even a policy level as well. Youth workers will know full well the extent of these pressures, but putting it into a textbook for me was the first step of getting it discussed at that sort of policy and that type of level.
Okay, so very interesting. So it's part academic, part lived experience, part what they've referred to as growing up in a violent adjacent environment. And obviously now we have these conversations about vicarious trauma and all the things surrounding it. So that space in between, kind of like you going to America, coming back in. So I assume you worked within the third sector, right?
Yeah, predominantly in the third sector. I had a little vacation, I guess, in the corporate sector, which was desperately unwise of me, because it's they're not my people, to put it that way.
Okay, interesting. So we look at, when we look at the trajectory of how we've responded to violence in this country, there was those early years where kind of people would just place on top of it kind of generic youth interventions. There were a lot of probably more YOS-based practitioners working on the agenda. Obviously, in that time there, those early years, there was YIPs all over the place, youth inclusion projects, for those who don't remember them. And then we kind of moved into this era. If you remember, there was a period where there was a report out called Dying to Belong, which is an interesting report. And then you had the weapons program with Sherry Blair and all that, those early 2000s, kind of interventions, knife bins and, all these things. And then we started to have the conversation about Glasgow. Yeah. We started talking about, and obviously I'm from that exotic city called Birmingham. And the conversation about a public health response to the violence was very much coined very early by, you're probably familiar with Dr. Martin Glynn or his work. And he was talking about it, I'm on about early 2000s. And then we had this conversation where we're going to start, looking at a public health response to violence, looking at the Glasgow model. A lot of people from England were flying up to Glasgow and doing all these like peer reviews, and there was a lot of things happening. Came back now, and more of the language. I think people understood the language a lot more. I'm not sure. We always questioned how can we make Glasgow look like Birmingham on a hot sunny day, or Brixton, or Moss Side, or or Croxteth, not Tuxteth, Croxteth. And so it wasn't a one size fits all, but we see now, fast forward many years, kind of across the sector, there's a big conversation about public health response to violence. You see, but when I don't know if it is, and a lot of the practitioners who I work with, who are some academics and some who are frontline, can't put their finger on it. So when I saw your book and you talk about your book, I thought, okay, this really interests me. So when you embarked on the book and you went back to the estate, or went amongst these young people, share with us what you saw. And obviously, let's be clear, it's a 200 plus page book, right? So we're not asking you to try and compress that into this live. And we'll tell people where they can get the book. But what did you see when you first got there?
Well, I think just to pick up on that last thing you mentioned about the public health approach to youth violence, one of the things which drove me, motivated me to not just undertake this piece of work, but to actually move back to the spaces and the area which I grew up in, was the principle of meeting young people, and specifically young men, where they're at. Getting them to move into a more sort of institutional space, a criminal justice space. For me, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Meeting young people where they were at, I think, for me, gave me an opportunity to see these young black men in their natural urban environments in which they felt most comfortable, that they created their own ecosystems, they created their own marketplaces. So they moved through these spaces with quite natural flair and natural skill. So I more specifically, Ray, I saw I saw that. I use the analogy of a marketplace. You know, if you move into a food market, an outdoor market of any kind, you see relationships, you see people interact, you see friendliness, and you see people who are just getting by, basically, and making a living. It may not be, you know, six-figure salaries or huge sums of money, but they're doing something that is part of their life, and they've bought into it as much as possible. I saw and I experienced some of the same sights and sounds and smells of my childhood. I've got this fondness for, it sounds rather daft, but I've got this fondness for the smell of palm oil, and any sort of West African cooking, Caribbean cooking which uses palm oil. I had that wafting through the estate, and it was very, very sort of nostalgic. It hadn't changed a great deal from when I was a kid, and I guess part of that is, you know, the physical space, the geography of so-called council estates. You know, they're sort of built sometime in the 50s or 60s or earlier, and then just let be, and they're left to sort of support and police themselves. And I still felt that was the case. I still felt that the estate, the people, the hierarchies around the estate were policing themselves. Kids were out in the swing parks. You had, I think I've written it into the book, you know, 8-year-olds being parents to younger siblings as well. And that, again, reminded me of being a kid. But it's so lots has changed, obviously, around us, but not a huge amount has changed on Maxwell, the estate, which forms part of the book. It was a really, I think the best word is a kind of nostalgic journey.
Yeah.
I happened to meet some of the people I'd grown up with as well, who still lived in and around the estate, and some were doing better than others.
So interesting. I mean, there's a conversation that I've been developing for many years about the architecture of violence, and I've actually spoke to heads of architecture departments at university about what are the side effects of those estates now. What are you know, because now they're tearing them down. You know, they're trying to tear them down. Some are being, you know, unfortunately tear down to build expensive bougie flats. But you know, that's another conversation another day. We're talking about, you know, what were the effects of that? You know, 200 people in a high rise, poor light, no space. You know, when the lift didn't work. You know, and then at the bottom of the flat, you've got that precinct with the off license and the chicken shop and the betting shop. And, you know, when people talk about the trap, you know, no one talks about the architecture of violence. So, so did you find that a lot of that was their world? Is that what you found out when you went?
Yeah, and those markers of a typical estate, as you mentioned there, Ray. You know, I think it's probably the same in any sort of big inner city urban area where these estates built 50, 60 years ago. You know, there's a sort of omnipresent sense of concrete everywhere. There's no sort of beautiful architecture. There is that classic sort of broken window hypothesis of, you know, if something feels unkempt or particularly not maintained, and the area around it, all of a sudden, you know, it starts to degrade somewhat. And that was a real feeling that, despite the fact that there was this sense of community pride, this sense of, you know, I'm from Maxwell, that wasn't necessarily reflected in the look and the cosmetic feel of the space. You know, you mentioned the kind of the lift not working. You know, quite often people would use stairwells for toilets, and there would be drug paraphernalia sort of dotted around stairwells. Those little sort of spaces that form areas where young people can congregate and smoke or drink or do it, they're still there. They're still there, and that those types of spaces those mini spaces haven't been addressed.
Interesting. I mean, in this world and these conversations about contextual safeguarding, those spaces weren't designed with contextual safeguarding in place. We both know that in terms of when it comes to writing and academia, there's a lot of pieces of work out there. I hold the position that youth work is best positioned to respond to violence, and I really mean that for multiple reasons. However, we see now, sadly, that more social and rightly so, but you have a lot of people involved in it, social services, CAMS, you name it, a lot of organizations involved in departments, which is good in one aspect. But one of the things that I ask, and for example, you mentioned that estate. I was in an estate, working opposite an estate in Manchester recently, and I was delivering some training, and I went out in the break time for some air and some lunch, and I came back and I said that estate is unique, and they said, Ray, 60% of those children on that estate live with their grandparents, and it was a white working class estate. So when you go into a place that, as you mentioned, Maxwell, where it's predominantly young black men, etc., there are those equivalents, aren't there, of white working class estates where some of the same social outcomes and the markers, violence, etc.
And it's not a question of ethnicity or race specifically. I chose the title of Young Black Street Masculinities to essentially represent the demography of Maxwell, to understand, the people who I grew up with were from predominantly Black African, Black Caribbean backgrounds. But you can remove the word black out of the title, and it represents still that same issue of pressures to be a certain way because of the code of the street, its sort of diktat, its rules, its regulations, and things like that, and then ethnicity and race and culture and religion is not part of the equation. It's just it's a result of that toxic environment, and this culture or youth subculture sometimes that pressurizes. I've chosen young men, but young women exactly is the same as well. Pressures young people to be a certain way for fear of being ostracized or victimized or worse.
Interesting. I want to share something with those the viewers and something that we talk about after, the notion of post-traumatic streets disorder. And I know in your book you referred to some of the side effects of that world, and I've been, like many practitioners out there, seeing the change, seeing how things have now, although, all around the country there are units dedicated to responding to violence. But what the question that we ask is, and we ask daily, is how do we mitigate? So, like most people out there, over the last few weeks, a lot of people lost a lot of night's sleep watching back-to-back episodes of Top Boy, and it was interesting that it's reached as far as it has. But in Top Boy, as you know, everybody knows, you've got mental health in there, you've got knife crime, you have father deficit, you have substance misuse, county lines, all the drivers. But what I'm asking people is, are they talking about Top Boy or are they talking about Peaky Blinders? Right? Because it's the same principle. When they used to send young children up the canal to sell whiskey to Camden from Birmingham, is that not county lines? I'm actually here right now. I'm actually 10 minutes from those houses where the Peaky Blinders were. But what's interesting, before the lockdown, there was a Peaky Blinders festival, right, where thousands of people dressed up in period clothing and turned up and celebrated Peaky Blinders. And then it dawned upon me, I wonder if 100 years from now there'll be a Burger Bar and Johnson's festival. I wonder if there'll be a Moss Side and Gooch and Donington, and Croxteth and Norris Green and the Brixton and Peckham Festival. And then so what I think the challenge is for a lot of practitioners is, well, what's interesting is now you can go into B&N and you can get Peaky Blinders shower gel, Peaky Blinders beard balm, So the gentrification of violence, and the point I'm getting at here is when they talk about the trap, and we talk about the commodification of violence. But what interests me is you go to an estate and we see this narrative of the black lads from the flats, and amazing work's been done. And one of the things that really interested me about your book is that it reads like you were advocating on behalf of them, which was interesting, not just kind of not voyeurism or tourism. He's advocating, saying, look, this is the outcomes of these young people because of these social ills. And that's that's what I really value, because a lot of people, predominantly black practitioners and academics, say a lot of the time it's almost these young people in those inner cities are treated like the zoo. People will go and put their nose against the glass, tap on the glass, watch them roar, won't go but will never get in there to feed them, never get into to change their circumstance. So I when I look at a lot of the conversations about and we call it the black lads from the flats, the narrative is, well, when I work in Liverpool, or I work in Cardiff, or I work in predominantly white working class communities, it's exactly the same. The social outcomes are exactly the same. In some cases, worse. But now we see, that old chestnut where it's not only commodified, it's gentrified, and that gentrification now has a pound sign with it. So when you're in there now and you're seeing these young men play out the masculinity, and in the bump it was talking about materialism and hyper consumerism, and is it because, do you think that that's now being reinforced and sold to them? So we got I mentioned to someone yesterday, actually on live, Charlie Dark, that when I looked at a recent drill award, drill song of the year, it was sponsored by a building society. Right?
It's crazy, isn't it? It is crazy.
So now we've got these young people already in a social dilemma, already in school, where they can only go to certain catchment schools. But what I ask is, and this is asked of most people, how do we as a sector, obviously you've grown up in those communities, you've worked in the third sector, you've done the academic piece, people like the National Youth Agency and national programs and youth services across the country are trying their best to avoid young people falling into the trap. But now you have multi-million, if not billion-pound companies like Puma setting up their fashion shows like crack houses, setting up their fashion shows. Look how they sent the invitation out with a trap phone. And people have seen this; it's widely available online. Design the fashion show like a crack house, the top right-hand corner, and then the notion is, and on the business end of it, those communities aren't involved, but no, the train that never fails to arrive. They commission some black lads from the flats to spit, and everybody knows they're not spitting about global warming. So that added pressure now, already those social challenges, the trap as they call it. Now you have the commercialization of it, because now and did you see that when you was there? Did you feel it? Did you feel that did you see those artists who were just dying to blow, as they say, or dying to go viral?
Yeah, there's I mean, I'm gonna paint a fairly bleak picture, if I'm honest, Ray. But I think there's a ray of hope which I'll try and end on. What I saw was exactly that. Was exactly the case of a lot of young black men who I met. Their aspirations and their dreams were focused almost entirely on doing something to get out of the hood, to get out of the ends, as they say. And for a lot of young men, it was drill. There was one young man character in the book who I've given the name Banks. I asked him to to give himself a pseudonym, and he chose that. But he is an aspiring drill artist. Whether he's consciously aware of that commercialization, I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure he would care. From the impression I got of him, he's happy making a few pounds, a few pennies. It gives him a little bit of status amongst his peers. It enables him to adorn himself with expensive-looking things. But interestingly and somewhat ironically, he still struggles to pay the electricity bill. So there's a tension always there between this commodification and what actually life is like on the estate. I think also, we've painted a somewhat bleak picture of this this bottom-up influence of the street, and I saw it as quite a pervasive influence. But you've just raised the point there, Ray. Now there's a top-down influence as well of whether it's Puma, whether it's Nike, whether it's Top Boy being portrayed in a certain way. That young black men have now got another set of pressures acting down upon them to be a certain way. When I was a kid, a lot of young men from the estate that I grew up on aspired to be footballers. Some of them still do, most of them still do. But there is this bubbling up now of, I aspire to be a drill artist. I aspire to be, an entrepreneur and stuff like that. Whether those pursuits are feasible, whether they're legitimate, is another question entirely. But they haven't got all of these young men. I found the thing that they have in common is that they've got these aspirations, but they've got very few role models, and that are not negative role models or nefarious role models. So that they've got all of these lovely aspirations, all of these pressures which are acting upon these negative pressures, but there's no form of real escape or something to sort of hang their identity on. So they give way to these top down and bottom up sort of pressures of commercialization in the street.
I want, and thank you for highlighting that. I want to go back as well before you see. This is not. There's those of you who've watched The Intent to. It's interesting because there's two scenes in The Intent to that I've always asked people to break down for me. There's the first scene where one of the fathers is dropping his son off to primary school. Now, the son looks at it about reception age. So when he drops the son off to school, his teacher is a black male primary school teacher. Halfway through the lesson, those of you who've watched it will be reminded of it. Halfway through the lesson in the film, the armed response unit burst in, point guns at the teacher, evacuate the classroom, search the classroom, and know that there's straps and food and drugs and all of that in the bag. So when I watched it, and I was like, did that really happen? I think last time I checked, I think out of 15,000 head teachers, I think only 12 are black males. But I carried on watching it. And then there's a part where they go country, they go OT, they go county lines. And this was the part for me. And this is why I feel that these stories that we, and how we capture the realities of a lot of young people now, we really have to understand, well, where's the negative messaging coming from? Identifying all the places. There's a part where they go, it looked like they're Essex, for example, A roads, loads of greenery, and they're arguing in the car, and they're going to meet the plug who was a farmer. So they pull into the farm, and those who watch this, remember it. They pull into the farm, Brendan. The plug, the farmer, is a Rasta with a South London accent in the middle of Essex. Now, I looked left and right when I was watching it. And what's interesting, because I'm sad, I had to go and find out how many black farmers there were in the UK, and there's only two, Wilfred Jones and the guy from JLS. But think about that now, from a creative perspective, whether we talk about Puma or we talk about these films, no one put their hand up and said, there aren't any black farmers.
Yeah.
No one put their hand up and said, are we sure we want to cast that teacher who's one of the only counter narratives
Mm.
in the film. He himself is still involved in the role or active or whatever.
Mm.
And this is this is one of the not the only challenge, but this is one of the challenges. I'm saying, well, this is now, I believe personally, and I don't know how everyone else feels, and feel free to comment in the chat. Are we talking about an ideological attack on a generation? I remember many years ago, people were talking about, in America, they refer to the road, like they call it domestic terrorism.
Mm.
And a lot of people push back on that because it was a heavy word to say. But if some of the things that you highlighted in your book, if that was, for example, something around radicalization, extremism, there's a clear pathway that that young person could be referred into.
Mm.
Whereas when it comes to systemic youth violence, there are very few referral pathways.
Mm.
So these young people can exit. Why do you think that is? And I'm not asking you because you're not the person who makes the decision, but from your academic lens and worked on the ground and so on, why do you think there's no referral pathway from young people to the level of something like radicalization? Because a lot of them would want to exit, right? Not everybody, people aren't happy there being in these traps, you know.
Yeah, I mean, the quick and dirty answer, Ray, is I'm not too sure I know. If you look at all of the evidence around youth violence, and now we're just talking like the bottom line of youth violence. You know, there's facts and figures which are all kind of always sloshing around. The last ones that I saw, you know, since 2008, I think there was a study done by Warwick University, and they reckon that since 2008, youth violence has cost the UK economy in excess of 10 billion. I don't know what the parallel figure is for terrorism, but I would say it's no more than that. I think there is there's some stark figures now and information and evidence around the largest cause of mortality for young men, other than suicide later on in their lives, is through youth violence, and that to me should create the motivation and the momentum to build these legitimate, authentic, and effective pathways. I have no idea why these pathways are not in existence.
So that's the question a lot of us are asking now. Is it a public health response to violence? If there's not referral pathways and organizations that are sustained effectively that can respond to the needs of these young men and women. And I think this is really important because I think one of the things we talk about is a community-centered public health response to violence. It's not an elephant in the room because we've had a conversation about this previously. So I and I just want to make sure that people aren't. I'm not blindsiding Brendan, and this isn't about Brendan. This is about what's apparent out there. But what we also see on top of that now, in terms of those organizations, and this is us, when we've been doing this work with the NYA, one of the things that we've been doing is going out and meeting and engaging and working with Black-led organizations, POC organizations.
Yeah.
This won't be no surprise to you, but it's important that we state this. Two things that kept coming up, those especially that were working with their communities. Organizations from outside the communities will be getting parachuted in and have the resources to come and work in there. Those communities wouldn't look like the communities that they're serving. So they're not resourced effectively. They're not what you've mentioned earlier about, they're not it's not a pro-social modeling kind of model where, you know, a lot of these organizations will go in and then go back to somewhere leafier and nicer and cleaner and safer, but be working on, it felt like they said, with these young people and families and communities. And also no sustainability. So a lot of them would be, you know, especially in the pandemic, couldn't see beyond 3 months of delivery in terms of their resources. So we've got big non-Black-led organizations working in those communities. Secondly, they don't have any equity in those communities. And we're not saying that they don't care or that they're not sincere about the work. We're not saying that. What we're saying is that it's this constant going in, doing something with them and leaving, and not capacity building the organization. And then finally, no sustainability. So whilst you're working with young people on that estate, did you get to meet some of the youth organisations or practitioners? And if so, what was that like?
So I think the thing to address up front is, and tying in with what you say there about a lack of representation, a lack of nativism, often from organisations from outside the community coming in. One thing which I was met with in the first instance was a resistance to me being white, a resistance probably down to the unfamiliarity that these young black men had with me and my presence. It was only after a series of conversations with some of the faces who were sort of towards the upper part of the estate's hierarchy that it became apparent for these young men that I had a degree of authenticity and I had a degree of, dare I say, credibility amongst them because I was from that same area. I may not sound necessarily like them. My accent has gone, more or less disappeared, but being able to refer to the fact that this guy runs a chicken shop and that chicken shop's all been there for the last 20 years, that this space is where this occurred, this event in time and stuff like that. So I even as technically as an outsider coming in, although I moved back nearby, having that historic perspective and being able to, in research terms, they call it researcher disclosure, being able to make these admissions of similarity enabled me to build that rapport fairly quickly between me and the young men I was working with. More specifically, Ray, I picked up on the legitimacy that the youth workers who accompanied me on my kind of field work, the legitimacy that they had with these young men. The youth workers more closely resembled the young men than I did. They still had the same Southeast London drawl that I used to have. They lived their lives with an authenticity as well. They moved through those same spaces quite fluidly and with dexterity. And that gave me, almost by proxy, by extension, gave me some credibility with these young men as well. So I guess if I was to offer any advice,
we call it the bring in.
Yeah. If I was to offer any advice to an external agency, so an organization who don't have an identity or a sense of belonging with Maxwell, for instance, is to work with those who do, and to work closely with those who do, and for it not to be the expectation to be not a quick turnaround of success. I had limited success in my engagement work. I was only able to engage a small number of young men meaningfully. I accept my own limitations in that, but part of that was because I just frankly didn't have enough time, and this is 2.5 years of work.
Yeah.
So to put that into perspective, if you're delivering a community-based project in an estate like Maxwell, you cannot expect meaningful change in a few short months or even a couple of years. It takes time to build credibility, to build that authenticity, to build that, I call it insider knowledge, but kind of nativism, this sense of why things are the way they are, what's the history of the spaces and the people within them, and that takes time, right? It takes a hell of a lot of time.
Totally. And if I got a pound for every time I've delivered training and someone's said to me, "Oh, Ray, I'm not from that community. I'm from a XYZ community, and my background's this, and I struggle." I said, and I pause, and because I really believe this, I believe a good youth worker can work in any community. After going through not kind of like a rites of passage, but after understanding the community where they're working with. I do believe that I've seen it, I've experienced it, and hopefully there's been times when I've delivered it myself. Do you feel, I mean, did in terms of, so we can get a vision of it, did it have a youth center there? Did it have youth workers, detached youth workers? What was the from the engagement perspective, what did it look like?
So there was very typical of an estate, inner city estate. It had a community centre, which was in a state of disrepair, not particularly well maintained. It didn't have really any modern or contemporary stuff in there because people were fearful that it would be stolen and such like. It was manned by basically a bunch of volunteers who were from the community and were doing sort of voluntary work or helping out in their spare time. The only what I would call sort of full-time professionals working in and of that space were the youth workers who used it as a bit of sort of an administrative hub. There were some small events that were put on. Some members of the community had birthdays and naming ceremonies and christenings and passings and stuff like that there as well. But essentially it was a space which would shield people from the rain and the kind of incremental weather, and where people would come and just hang out very informally and very casually. I don't think it necessarily served a space for youth work practice or rehabilitation or anything like that, anything therapeutic. So I think putting the words in somewhat into the mouths of the youth workers, they preferred to do their therapy on the streets because it felt that much more natural. It felt that much more engaging. Again, it goes back to that point of meeting young men in the book, meeting young men where they were at, rather than asking them to come to you. You met them where they were at in their spaces, in their homes sometimes as well.
Yeah, I hear that. I think people who will be watching this or have watched it will be. It's we're not hearing, something that most youth workers aren't familiar with in terms of the estate or those communities. How does the sector break the cycle? Because it is a pandemic. Youth violence is a pandemic. It's a problem. And I'll ask you straight: do you think we're responding to it in a public health manner, in your own personal opinion?
If we are, certainly we're doing it in a fairly piecemeal way. Okay. I think as with any sort of response to a pandemic, we've got some obviously very recent experience of that from the COVID-19 perspective. If you want to create sea change, everyone needs to be pulling in the same direction. Everyone needs to be pointing their compass towards the same objective and the same goal. And investment needs to be long-term and have that long-term change in view. There are small pockets of organizations, institutions, and movements that are bought into that perspective and that approach. You mentioned the NYA. I would say organizations like UK Youth as well have that vision of creating significant, meaningful change through a long-term lens, and through things like professionalization of youth work, raising the status of youth workers as well. And it's probably not a contentious opinion to say that a lot of the youth workers that I met certainly held the same view, that they were seen dimly within the professional sphere because they weren't social workers. They didn't have, a master's degree. They didn't have, but they had experience of working with hard to reach or marginalized communities that no textbook, that no doctorate from UCL would ever be able to give me. And I lent heavily onto that experience. But there's very few, to answer your question very briefly, that there are very few people, organizations, institutions who have invested themselves in a public health approach. And it is only, in my opinion, only through that longer term view of getting youth workers who are supported and familiar with the communities in which they work, who represent the communities in which they work, be that through their lived experience, their race, their ethnicity, their background, etc. I know that, for example, St. Giles, the organisation St. Giles, has a policy of hiring ex-offenders or those with criminal backgrounds. And to me, there need to be more organisations who support initiatives like that, not only a sense of kind of social rehabilitation, but it creates a cohort of youth workers who can speak with a lived experience and a credibility and authenticity that others coming from the outside can't and probably never can.
Yeah, yeah. I think we're also in a place now where, where the conversation, resources are limited, even more so. Ideas are high though. We've got, there's a lot of ideas and great ideas, and I think what I would love to see is that every major city in the UK has a referral pathway that has the same wraparound support, like someone was falling into radicalization. The same multi-agency response as well, with youth work, with the youth sector around the table. But when you look over there, there's CAMP. When you look over there, there's social services. When you look over there, there's representation from the faith spaces. Just a multi-agency response, and I think that's few and far between at the moment. But I think we can build on that. The title of today's session, though, was White Practitioners in Black Spaces. And because one of the traumas that came out of the conversation around racial justice was about most people of color felt that they brought their best self to spaces, but not their whole self, and that there was a level of them being muted and us being muted in some key spaces. And I think a lot of work's been gone on over the last 24 months to challenge that and push back. And you can visibly see that there's the needle's moving.
Yeah.
It's not as far as it needs to be, but it's moving. No one can deny that. I think going forward, though, do you feel because some people will say, well, how is this white academic going to go into the ends and go into the estate? And we've heard this before, and it's fetishization, and people say all these, we see these things, and there is some truth in it, because we've seen historically where reports have come out that never trickle down.
Yeah.
Big massive reports on shelves that never trickle down to the people that need it the most. How can we ensure, what would your advice be to academics who do this type of work, say, to make sure that your findings trickle down to local authorities, to community organizations, to that small organization that could do with some of the knowledge, wisdom, and understanding that people have found, rather than it being a kind of an academic exercise and it's lined up with the rest of the reports? What would your advice be to academics?
Well, I think it's quite a challenging question, because it requires a few things, Ray. I think first and foremost, I was very fortunate to be in the position to write this book using that lived experience, but using that level of nativism that others perhaps don't have. I'm not kidding myself. I'm certainly in the minority, and people who grow up in spaces like Maxwell that I grew up in often don't aspire to write textbooks, academic or otherwise, about their experiences. So I think possibly it's helpful to encourage these young men and women growing up in these spaces to have the platforms to voice their experiences on a more regular basis. And I'm not talking, TikTok or Twitter or anything like that. I think something which is going to capture the imagination of policymakers and practitioners alike. I think academia, to use that very broad brushstroke, has got a real challenge, and it's always had a problem historically with a representation from the Black community. There are very few academics certainly in my space, so that sort of criminology, sociology, youth space, who are academics of color, and that needs to change. How that goes about, obviously, you have to move all the way upstream, thinking about supporting young people of color within educational institutions to be more aspirational when it comes to further or higher education, getting more young Black boys, in my instance, into the education system and giving them the platforms to write lived and authentic texts and experiences in textbooks as well. Certainly my work is okay, I think, hopefully, but it can be improved upon by someone who is a person of color from that same background, doing it justice through their own lens as well. And I acknowledge again and again in the book that it is the lens of a white researcher. I think last but no means least, academia has implicitly tended to write information and evidence for textbooks. And textbooks and journal articles and such like, very few people consume them, very few people digest them. Whether it's the prohibitive cost of a textbook, whether it's journal articles sat behind academic paywalls and things like that, they are not accessible. They're not open access knowledge or information. And so it gathers dust. And very soon it becomes obsolete. So more academic pursuits, so journals, even grey literature, but with an academic slant, need to be produced, which are more accessible for practitioners. Yep. A very close friend of mine who I think you may know, Ray, Sean Monaghan, who's a wonderful ex-Red Thread colleague of mine, has endeavored to do exactly that, which is operate in what's called a third space. So that space between academia and practice, and being able to have a foot in both camps, take the best from academia, the best in class, which has a degree of academic rigor, and then apply it in the real world, and then adapt it culturally, socially, to fit the communities that you're working with, and then feed it back into academia to apply the same rigor again. So there needs to be that discourse and that conversation between practitioners and academia to build that third space.
Totally. And fortunately, I've been able to travel around the country and see different communities, whether it be South Asian, Pakistani communities, white working class communities, Afro-Caribbean, African communities. This city, tragically, I think is still the gun crime capital of the UK. And, so Peaky Blinders is nothing new to us as a concept. But I would love really, and it's one thing that I think most people do, is that, back to what I said initially, that youth work is better placed than most to respond to this. And I just feel that it's kind of a lot of other spaces have tried to kind of like get involved, and that's good. It's important because it's multi-agency. But when we think about space, when we think about relationships, when we think about, when we think about the history of how youth work has responded to other issues, I think it's really, really important that it doesn't get sidelined, and it kind of like, it's front and center. I'm going to give people the opportunity to ask questions if you want. The chat's open. Feel free to ask questions to myself or Brendan. Primarily Brendan, because he's got the PhD. Maybe I'll get mine one day. But I've also understand that there's a lot of people out here who've got a lot of experience, which sometimes people with academic qualifications, put them in a room of young people and they freeze. We've all seen that one, and the conversations right now are about going forward. So if you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the comments. If people aren't going to do that, what I would say is, Brendan, what next steps? How can people get hold of your book? It's I know it's an academic piece, and you mentioned about, you whispered the word price because that's what the question people have said to you. Well, Brendan, this is a great book, but I'm gonna have to take out a loan for this one. People have said that, but what's your view on it?
I think I mean, to be explicit about the cost is prohibitive. And Ray, you and I spoke about this before we joined this conversation. I pushed back quite heavily on the publishers. I'll probably get myself into a whole heap of trouble by saying this, but I'll say it. I pushed back to the publishers saying, look, I wrote this book partly in a sort of for a sense of catharsis almost, We spoke earlier about sort of the sense of trauma and vicarious trauma. So there was a cathartic element to it. But certainly the main audience for the book was policymakers and youth work practitioners. There is certainly sort of the final chapter or so is very much focused on youth work practice and some of the blueprints and the archetypes that youth workers might be able to tap into in order to mitigate this culture of chasing resources and chasing status that a lot of these young black men were experiencing. The cost in itself is in excess of £100 for a textbook. I'm pretty sure that Harry Potter's first edition is no less expensive, and it genuinely brings me a little bit of embarrassment. But
it shouldn't. You know why it shouldn't? Because it's on the same shelves as those other books that I've got are a lot more higher priced. But what I would say is this, because as I said, with anyone involved in academia, when it comes to research and books and so on, it's a whole new world. But what I would say is this: if an organization wanted to reach out to you, Brendan, to say, look, can you jump on a live and just summarize, or could you deliver a workshop, or could you just say, look, share some of your findings? What would your response be?
I would do that in an absolute heartbeat, Ray. I think, again, I'll be very mindful about the words that are about to come out of my mouth. There are many ways for the book to be shared, be they verbally or visually. There's many different ways to share the book.
Excellent. So you heard it from the person, the author. Someone's asked a question here. P.S. What are these new youth work insights that are in your book? As a seasoned practitioner and academic, I am interested.
So I think it's I think from a youth work practice perspective, it's there's one character in my book who I've given the name Darius, and Darius is a man of status and standing among the estate. He is an alumni of the same estate. We didn't cross paths necessarily when we were much younger, but I knew of him. His abilities to portray and appear credible for the young men that he was steering and safeguarding and supporting was something which I haven't seen necessarily in the flesh before. And he was constantly walking a tightrope. On one hand, he needed to appear credible and authentic in order for people to buy into his philosophies, to buy into his advice. But simultaneously, he had to model what I call a more inclusive masculinity, one which is more caring, which is more empathetic, which is more pro-social. And so he was playing two characters simultaneously. He carried himself, he adorned himself, he clothed himself in a way and spoke in a way which made him appear credible from that sort of street perspective, but also he carefully curated and modeled that more inclusive masculinity as well. And he was very mindful about the spaces and the opportunities he took to do exactly that. So modeling two masculinities simultaneously, I think is a fairly innovative approach. And I also think that having that insider knowledge to understand to what extent the young men on the estate, what extent they were going to reinforce these masculine identities. And I use the term myth making in the book. And there was a lot of storytelling. And communities, inner city communities have a long history of storytelling. But for Darius, the youth worker, it was the knowledge and his youth work practice to differentiate what was storytelling for storytelling purposes and what was myth making, and what young men were using in order to portray a certain status, to move themselves up the street hierarchy, and to create that sacred resource of respect, and having that tool in his toolkit, I think was part of his quite innovative, forward-thinking youth work practice.
Really interesting, because yesterday we had Charlie Dark on the session. He was talking about not just sending a lift down to young people, but a generation that you may or may not agree with in terms of their culture, their music, what's going on, but being that youth worker, or that youth practitioner that will always be there for them if they need it, and giving them that door, keeping the door cracked open and saying, okay, they might not be ready for me now, but that they have to know that door's always open, and I will meet them on that bridge. I'll always be there for them on that bridge. And it was an interesting theory. We I'm going to put a few more questions. What should be done to secure professional respect for youth workers in these settings where youth work is evidently the most effective practice? So what should be done to secure professional respect for youth workers in these settings where youth work is evidently most effective? That comes from Lee, Chief Executive of NYA.
I mean, I think it's a fabulous question, because I think that there are, I mentioned it earlier, that there's a long history of youth workers being seen from the outside to be of a less professional standing, or a lower professional standing than colleagues who work in similar spaces with similar groups of young people. You think of those who work in criminal justice and social work, and there is a long, drawn out, quite rigorous professionalization process that these people have to go through. Youth work, I think, is making great strides towards having itself respected as a profession, equally to the social workers and those working in those kind of criminal justice spheres. I think there's a long way to go. We were talking before we went live about the funding from UK Youth, and I'm very, very proud, just to sort of plug my own organisation for the moment. The Westminster Foundation, who I work for, and the Hans Rousing Trust have given a tranche of funding to UK Youth to distribute with the objective of professionalising the youth work sector. So that is giving youth workers access to those academic spaces that we mentioned earlier, getting youth workers, giving them the platform and giving them the oxygen in order to present at conferences, to present at events, to hold roundtables and symposiums, and get the right people around the table to hear their conversations, and frankly as well, to get them a little bit more kudos amongst their peers in the sector. And I think all of those things, as they sort of come together and as they converge, I think what will happen is that people will be attracted to become youth workers, and the whole thing raises up another level as well.
Yeah, and I know I'm also conscious as well. Other organisations are starting to. I know there's a rise up going on in London at the moment to capacity build organisations, specifically practitioners working with around youth violence. NYA have got multiple things going on in the background and up front around that whole capacity building and the curriculum and the CPD and professionalising it at a high level. So I'm from a youth work perspective. Obviously, you have a stronger leadership than some sectors. I feel going forward, as I said, I'm going to put your Twitter handle up on there. If people want to reach out to you, feel free to reach out to Brendan on Twitter. I'd like to thank you on behalf of Equal Equity and NYA for coming through. And it's not been an easy conversation. The title's not an easy title, but the more that we have these conversations and create brave spaces, and as I said, from reading through it, I read that you came from an advocacy perspective rather than a safari perspective, and people know what I mean about the safari perspective, where it's kind of, oh, guess what I saw over there, and we got to meet the Mau Mau, and that kind of conversation, rather than we saw, well, this is what needs to be done to support and aid those young people. Thank you for your time.
It's a pleasure.
You know, people get hold of Brendan on Twitter. As I said, I think he mentioned in nicest possible ways that you can get hold of the book, but reach out to Brendan, and I'm sure he will support that and come into your spaces and talk furthermore about some of the findings. And, you know, thank you on behalf of NYA and Equal Equity. This is Ray Douglas from the Equity Festival. Look out for our next session and final session tomorrow, which is all about wounded healers, which is interesting. Thank you all very much. Stay blessed. This is the Equity Festival. Peace.